On this episode of Athletic Training Chat, we chat with Joe Greene and Mike Van Veghel, who are both athletic trainers in the state of Wisconsin. And really, this discussion focuses on a lot of things that have happened with governmental affairs in the state of Wisconsin, but I think have really broad-reaching applications to any state, depending on where they are in their licensure or their practice act. We talk about the removal of physician signature from protocols. We talk about the work that is being done on parity language, her insurance, and what that looks like in terms of opening up options for billing for services in a clinical setting, and also about removing the word vigorous from the Practice Act, and really just kind of what all that means and the nuance that goes into it when it comes to what that could mean for athletic trainers, specifically in Wisconsin. But again, I think they have broad-reaching applications across states, again, depending on where practice acts and things are at. Before we get into it, thank you to Mueller Sports Medicine for powering us and for helping out the profession, helping support us and Clinically Presco with cold tub donations. We were able to get out 16 this year. We're excited about that, and we can't wait to do more. But without further ado, please enjoy this episode. So we're here with Joe Greene and Mike Van Veghel today, and we're talking very broadly, but also somewhat specifically about government affairs, reimbursement, and everything that goes into the advocacy around the legislative side of athletic training. It's obviously a big topic. A lot of things happen with it, but the more I seem to figure out trying to understand it, the less I realize that I had any clue what was actually happening. And so this is really trying to bring some information to that, both for my own understanding, but for everybody else. And so with that, I wanted to, before we get started, turn it over to Joe. We'll start with you. Just if you could give your background, professionally, and then also your multifaceted role and everything that has gone into your work, and then we'll turn it over to Mike.
Sure. Thanks, Joel. Thanks for having both of us on as well. My name is Joe Greene. I spent 32 years with the University of Wisconsin Hospital, working across their sports medicine and orthopedic departments as an athletic trainer clinically, but as an administrator for approximately the last 20 years of that time. So I also oversaw athletic trainers in all different roles there, to include their initial integration into outpatient rehabilitation and billing, which is pertinent to the discussion today. Additionally, I was on the WATA board of directors for 12 years, I believe. I was a past governmental affairs chair and president from 2006 to 2010, and we did a fair amount of governmental affairs work during that time. So beyond that, I currently do own my own company called OrthoVise, and I work closely with the NATA and the WATA on a lot of advocacy issues, regulatory affairs issues, and help to facilitate the growth of reimbursement, appropriate reimbursement for athletic trainers across the country. That's a work I really enjoy, and obviously we're very involved in a governmental affairs process right now within the state. And Mike and I have worked pretty closely together for quite some time in these activities.
Mike?
Well, again, thanks for putting this together. This is my first podcast, so it's kind of a cool thing. And
I'm always about getting people on their first podcast. That's my goal.
And you provided a great teammate for me here today too. Joe's work has been really complimentary to what we're doing. So a shout out to him and his group, because their work has been really well aligned with what we're trying to achieve, both locally and nationally. I currently also work for UW Health Sports Medicine. I have a variety of roles. I work primarily in our sports outpatient rehabilitation clinic, where I have my own caseload, just like any of our therapists. I've been doing that for several years. I was kind of the first athletic trainer to step into that role here for UW Health, and then we've expanded it both here and fortunately through a lot of the efforts of our past reimbursement committee and our governmental affairs committee, we've been able to expand that role for athletic trainers throughout the state. And then it kind of served as kind of a template for a lot of other states to build from. So we've been doing that for quite a while. I also work 1 day a week in one of our physician clinics, and I'm the athletic trainer for Madison College in their athletic department. My first job out of college back in the early 90s was in an outpatient physical therapy clinic where I basically functioned as an aide. And that was kind of my first exposure to some of the I guess, turf battles that can show up in certain settings. And just like, people have talked about the political side of that, for me, functionally, I was kind of exposed to kind of some of the stay in your lane type of attitudes that certain other healthcare professionals had. And it kind of opened my eyes up because I was basically in the clinic there functioning as an aide, putting hot packs on people, doing ultrasounds, not really doing a whole lot of independent work. And then I was also kind of serving as an outreach athletic trainer for the Oshkosh School District. But that's one of the things that kind of springboarded me into more involvement from a governmental affairs standpoint. And part of the argument for us not having our own kind of independent practice or autonomy at that time was we weren't yet licensed. And so I know that'll be a topic we'll talk about in a second, but kind of moving that push forward towards licensure and kind of validation of our profession, our credential, and our skill set was something that I was attracted to right away. From there, I spent time working at the college university, setting up at UW-Stevens Point, and then I've been back down here in Madison. This is my, I think, 26th year. So Joe and I have been kind of around for a while. We've seen some really great things happen, but I think where we're at right now is kind of an exciting opportunity because we've got some things that are kind of paralleling our progress just with the Licensure Act in and of itself, whether it's advancements in our educational programs and ATEPs and the competencies that have advanced with that. And then, like I said, Joe's work where we're actually starting to collect data on our outcomes and kind of the financial viabilities and advantages that clinics can have by employing athletic trainers. So we're really looking forward to what is going to lie ahead. It's going to be a battle, and we'll get into that, I'm sure. But hopefully we'll just kind of keep pushing forward, and we'll just kind of keep chipping away, and we'll keep moving ourselves forward so we can just fully practice to what our Practice Act allows us to do and says we should and can do.
So jumping right into that, I think if we could give the history, and obviously this is going to be different from state to state in terms of how things have gone, but with both of you being involved in Wisconsin's history of getting licensure and why that was so important, as you alluded to. And on top of that, you mentioned our Practice Act and that importance, the foresight when it originally happened and how to go about it, kind of the plus and minuses there. And then I'm speaking on my own ignorance here. Have we revised ours, multiple times, and how those processes go? So whoever wants to take the first stab at that, please do.
Mike, why don't I let you take that as the current chair, and then I'll add a few things on from what I see around the country and the importance of it.
Yeah, sure. Well, I kind of just touched on some of the importance of developing the Practice Act. In many ways, it kind of validates our profession as healthcare providers. And it was kind of a stepwise process. The athletic training profession kind of emerged kind of in its current form in the 70s and 80s. That's when we achieved kind of recognition by the AMA, which is a big step as a allied healthcare profession. And then from there, it was improving our skill sets through the competencies developed by the BOC and all the ATEPs, improving our nationwide certification process, and then kind of standardizing those things where we could kind of use that as a foundation to start creating our Practice Acts from. I wasn't there when those first discussions started happening, but my recollection of that time back in the mid 90s was they started kind of looking at what other professions were doing that were licensed, and that kind of served as kind of a template. And then from there, it became a lot of a negotiation process and bargaining amongst us, physician groups, and other healthcare providers within the state. So the one thing about creating and developing and then owning a Practice Act is it's basically a public entity, right? It's part of our state government. And so as that has developed, there'll be hearings and there's opportunities for not only other healthcare providers, but other associations, other people that have a stake in the outcome of that legislation, and certainly the public. So there was a tremendous amount of dialogue. And I think whenever you're looking at developing a Practice Act and modifying one that already exists, you kind of are trying to look at the big picture, and there's kind of a dance there between the language that you use, but also the restrictions that come with certain language. So by, it takes some skill to kind of author those things and write it in a way that means a lot, but doesn't say a lot, because we want it to kind of create opportunities, and we don't want it to be restrictive. But kind of by definition, a Practice Act defines what your practice is. So we needed to kind of mirror what our skill set was, what our training was, what our professional competencies were, and what types of things were in kind of the early versions of the role delineation studies. And we kind of created our Practice Act language based on that. And then that's also kind of what evolved into our protocol list with all those skills and competencies that are listed in that. And then from there, it was just pretty much negotiation. And we'll get into some of the changes that we're currently making and amending. But some of the original language was just negotiated in. And that term vigorous is a good example of that. The physician protocol is a good example of that. Anytime there's somebody that views a Practice Act as expanding dramatically a scope of practice, there needs to be some justification for that. And at that time, part of the justification was the strong relationship that not only we in Wisconsin, but nationwide we had with our physician groups. And once we got our physician groups on board, that was a huge feather in our cap, I guess, and a huge advantage as we kind of move forward pushing the Practice Act through. And once we had the Practice Act authored, then it was a matter of both grassroots and grass tops efforts. So using all of our advantages with our relationships of our professional teams, all the community relationships we've established through our outreach athletic trainers, and then getting the membership engaged to just get in front of the legislature. And at that time, a lot of that push was just educating them as to who we are and what we do. And back then, if Joe and I had a dime for every time we had to explain the difference between an athletic trainer and a personal trainer, we'd have a hell of a lot of dimes. So that was a big part of it, is just not only educating the public and the legislature and even other healthcare professions and physicians what we do, but it was a big part of actually educating our membership as to what that licensure meant and what their role and what their stake was and what we needed them to do to help support it. And then once it gets to that point, there's that dance and negotiation that happens at the Capitol. And our Practice Act eventually was passed in 1999. It was tacked on to a budget bill. If you're familiar with our state politics, the budget is usually due in February. It usually gets published later in the summer, and then they argue about it for who knows how long. So ours was kind of slid into that through some pretty savvy legislating by our sponsors at that time, and with the help of our lobbyists. And once that was established, then we were off and running. And then some states do require their Practice Act to be reevaluated every so many years. Like usually it's between 5 and 10 years. They call that a sunset provision, where they kind of have to review the Practice Act, and it's a way to determine if it's even necessary. Is it worth the logistics and all the resources that are required to administer the license and police it and then to regulate it. We didn't have that provision, but it's something that, as Joe alluded to earlier, that we kind of just took on ourselves as an association to, okay, here's where we are now, but as soon as we had the Practice Act, we looked at it and we're like, well, where do we want to be? And then you start kind of creating your time frames and your game plan and kind of your vision, I guess, for where not only the profession's going, but where the Practice Act wants to go. And we want those to kind of follow along with each other. And so that's kind of been the process since then. And as we go through every couple of years, we kind of reevaluate as we gather more information, as we kind of refine our profession and as our profession advances. We just want to make sure that the Practice Act is mirroring what we're capable of and what we can provide to the healthcare community and the patients and people we treat and care about.
Fantastic. Thank you for that summary. Joe, did you want to, add, or as you mentioned, nationally, and then I got maybe a follow-up for both of you once you're finished?
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit to what Mike said, and provide maybe a little bit of my own opinion on governmental affairs and what is effective. But certainly a Practice Act needs to represent what the current state of practice is in that state. And that's always a moving target because it's changing. And so I think that's been our goal in the state of Wisconsin, is to be proactive with looking at our Practice Act and making changes as they're indicated, but also to have some regular time frame that we're trying to update this to allow for athletic trainers to be able to work to the top of their scope and to the top of their training. And so that's really important for a few reasons. Is number one, you rarely get everything that you want throughout a legislative process, and you do have to continue to go back, but you also stay relevant in front of legislators if you're in front of them, every 3 to 5 years. And sometimes that may not be a Practice Act bill you're in front of them with. It could be something related to us that we get involved with. But it's really important for ATs to be able to stay in front of our legislators and to be able to advocate with them. And so that's something I just wanted to emphasize first. So when I talk with other states is I really do discuss the importance of opening your Practice Act to being willing to look at improving it. And what has really been, I think, great to see, even with the pandemic going on, is the amount of state governmental affairs activities that occurred throughout the pandemic and has continued. And so we are really to the point now where obviously California is a large issue, but South Carolina recently received their licensure status, and that becomes active, I believe, in a few months. New York is on the verge of that. So it is really important for athletic trainers nationally to have as much standardization as possible. Licensure does open up the door to be able to bill and be reimbursed by payers. But also, if we're talking about government payers in the future, it's really important to have as much standardization across the country as possible. So California needs regulation. That's clear to all of us for all sorts of reasons. But they also need regulation if ATs are going to be reimbursed in California. And also if we're going to consider, some other larger objectives at the national level. So that is something I think, as membership associations, the NATA, the WATA, all state associations have in mind, is they want to allow athletic trainers in their state to be able to practice to the full extent of their knowledge, skills, and abilities and their license. And it is a really large objective of these associations to be able to advocate professionally. And, hopefully throughout, our discussion today, you'll realize some of the ways that not only the WATA helps support that, but also we do it nationally.
Appreciate that. Just kind of on the general thing of licensure, again, it's one of those for me, like, I don't know what I don't know, because I have only been really involved with the board for a couple of years, still don't know what I don't know when it comes to it. But maybe some of the biggest challenges that you both have faced throughout the process, and you can pick, one single point in time, or just in terms of getting licensure, maintaining licensure. I don't want to say conflicts, but discussions or negotiations, as Mike had mentioned, with other healthcare professions, or just kind of the most surprising thing that people would be like, oh, I didn't realize that went into this process. If you had to pick maybe one or two things.
Go ahead, Mike. You'll lead. I'll figure out something else.
That's a really good question. And it's one that could probably take up the full length of our podcast time here.
That's fair.
with any association activities, I think part of it is engagement, right? Trying to activate our membership, so we all are educated, we're communicating effectively, we're all kind of moving forward kind of on the same page. Our profession makes that even more challenging just based on the schedules that we operate on.
Yep.
Right. You know, many of our members are working long hours. They don't have control of a lot of their schedule because some of it depends on their own athletic schedules. It depends on the weather at times. For somebody like me, I'm going from location to location, then throwing some teaching responsibilities in there. So it is challenging to engage people, especially when it needs to be done quickly. So we just had a committee hearing last week on our current amendments that we're proposing. And obviously you've probably seen the e-blasts and the communications coming across, you know, asking for members to contact their legislators and those types of things. So you try to make that as easy as you can. Although we still know when we look at the statistics of how many of those emails get opened and read, it's still pretty low. And, you know, historically our members are fairly active, but we just need to make sure that we have that kind of ability to mobilize them quickly. And at times it is challenging. That committee hearing was announced within a week of when it actually happened, and they always occur in the middle of the day. So you have to scramble just to get people there, so we can kind of represent and voice our opinion. And fortunately, we had a great turnout last week. As far as things that are surprising, you know, I think if you do your homework and you know kind of the environment you're in, it's challenging to be really surprised. And I think our committee and our work with our lobbyists, they're really well versed on the people that work down at the Capitol. They're very well established in kind of the legislative environment. So working with them and kind of being very proactive and kind of trying to foresee the path that some of these legislative approaches follow, it helps to minimize that. Every once in a while, you'll be surprised based on commentary or testimony or opposition that shows up. I know back in the day when we were involved in the concussion legislation, I was kind of surprised. I actually talked with some of our fellow athletic trainers that weren't exactly comfortable with some of the provisions that the concussion law provided, meaning especially return to play decisions. So there are times where you kind of step back and like, okay, maybe I need to cast a wider net instead of just kind of being hawk's eye kind of locked into something where I'm just focusing on that immediate language or the immediate scenario. Sometimes you need to soar a little bit higher, kind of get a bird's eye or a sky high drone view where you're kind of casting a wider net of understanding to make sure that, again, we're all on the same page and moving forward.
Yeah, and I'll probably just comment on I think the importance of trying to build relationships with other entities out of peer respect with those other entities, because so much in healthcare, there isn't truly an ability to stay in your lane. There's a lot of crossover with the things that we do with other orthopedic types of providers. So I think I'll kind of relate it through a story of back when I was president between 2006 and 10, and we were working on legislation that got stalled multiple times, primarily by the PT lobby in the state. And we, over the course of time, hadn't worked particularly well together. And Senator Erpenbach, at the time, as the chair of the Senate Healthcare Committee, basically told both of our leadership is that you need to figure this out before I hear either of your bills again, and go back and compromise, because he wasn't an expert, or anyone on the committee wasn't an expert on scope of practice issues. So, I think that, in an idealistic world, that's how good legislation happens. But it made us actually meet with each other, talk to each other, understand our objectives, not only ours, but also theirs. And I think even to this day, there has been some lasting ability to communicate and work together. Hopefully we can continue that throughout this next process as we work through this current bill. But it really helped us get to our objective. We didn't get everything that we wanted in our amendment in 2010. But once we had agreed on our practice acts respectively with the PTs, our bills flew through committees and flew through both the Assembly and the Senate and were signed by the governor in like a 3-week time frame, I think, if I remember that. So, but there was no opposition, and we had worked through the issues with everyone else. And so, so I think building those relationships is important. I think when I compare what we have in Wisconsin with some of the other healthcare groups and entities, we're in a really fortunate spot compared to what I see nationally in many ways. I do think it has improved with some of those groups that we generally have conflict with, but I think it's incredibly important to work on building those relationships, not just for governmental affairs reasons, because it's important, but also even at the patient care level. So, but I think, that's something that we realistically are going to have to deal with. And these other entities are doing the same things we are, is they're looking at their scope of practice, their education and training is expanding. What healthcare employers want them to do is changing, just like it is for us. And our bill has to change accordingly over time, or our practice act has to change accordingly over time. So, but it's something that you have to consider in your governmental affairs role, and our lobbyists have to consider. And at some point, I think you just have to realize, you are going to have to stand your ground and compete and hold on to what your values are, no matter what your opposition is. But working with them effectively is truly important.
I appreciate that. Go ahead.
One of the takeaways from Joe's story of with Senator Erpenbach, that kind of opened my eyes a little bit. And it was something that I kind of always was aware of, but when you have two groups that want something, if they both want something to pass, those negotiations seem to go a lot more quickly and a lot more efficiently, versus if it's just one side asking for something and the other side opposing it. And Joe used the term relationship building. In my experience, in the 20 or so years I've been involved with this, the bills that we are most successful with are bills that we've built coalitions with other individuals. So whether it's promoting something, or for example, a few years ago, our legislature was looking at shutting down some of the credentialing boards, which is the kind of regulatory group for each individual healthcare profession. We basically joined up with almost every healthcare group or every licensed healthcare provider, and that got shut down very, very quickly. So Joe's right. What ultimately this comes down to is are we improving patient care? Are we maintaining a high standard of care that we can provide? And, are we properly advocating for our profession, as Joe said, allowing us to practice to our skill set? So we can never lose sight of the fact that we're not the only ones providing patient care, right? And I think
Absolutely.
one of the benefits of us expanding into clinical rehabilitation settings is it just naturally created more camaraderie and understanding between us, kind of at that local or individual clinical level. And that's only helped to kind of expand things over time. But Joe's right. Legislation and governmental affairs is really about relationship building, developing understanding between those groups, and then advocating through those activities on behalf of our patients that we take care of.
Kind of taking a turn and getting a little more specific to the state of Wisconsin, but I think there can be applications across the country with this, based on what people are going. There's kind of been three main goals, at least in my working knowledge of recently, as we've been looking at our Practice Act, that we've been trying to get through and all kind of tie together in different ways. One that went through within the last year or two. I feel like time has stood still and also went as fast as possible over the last several years. So I don't remember exactly. Was the removal of physician signature from the athletic trainers protocol in Wisconsin. I think that obviously was a big step, but I'm not entirely sure, even in talking with colleagues within the state, that everybody fully understands what that meant and why that was important. So if we could start, I think Mikey had mentioned it a little bit of like that was part of the process of, licensure and having a good relationship with physician groups there. but what that actually meant and why removing it was a big step, and what that now means for specifically ATs in Wisconsin and how they can practice.
Well, I mean, there's kind of a two-pronged approach as to why that was important. I guess a simple word that describes it is we want to try to achieve independence or autonomy in what we do.
Yep.
While our relationships with our physicians are important, they're vital, right? We need to kind of be able to maintain that continuity of patient care and those communication pathways. One of the problems that the protocol and physician signature requirement kind of produced, or one of the effects of that, was you often had physicians then taking on some sort of liability of that athletic trainer's actions. And over time, some of our physicians in the state started to kind of pull back on that because of that liability issue. It did create kind of some unique issues where you had new athletic trainers coming into environments where maybe the physician didn't know that person, but now we're suddenly asking them to sign off on their skill set and kind of be their so-called mentor. And I don't want to use the word supervisor, but that was kind of the mindset that many of them had. And they thought, well, I'm not directly supervising this person. This person's off at their school and making decisions on the sideline and doing those types of things. There was kind of that perceived liability issue that became kind of problematic from their end. So it was a huge step in terms of helping us develop that autonomy. And if somebody wanted to, say, create their own practice, whether it was an independent clinical setting or whether they wanted to go out and work in an industrial setting or whatever it may be, it became a challenge to find a physician that would kind of agree to be their consulting physician. And so the other thing is some of the language in the Practice Act, looking at the physician signature, required us to communicate with a consulting physician if we had issues with a patient or an athlete that we were treating. So that was one of the things we pulled out earlier, simply because the physician had no idea who my starting shortstop was here at METC. The kid's from, Verona, but my consulting physician is over here on the east side of town. So there were just kind of some logistical things that came into play. But I think the biggest thing was encouraging people to kind of view themselves as kind of an independent healthcare provider, but that's part of an overall sports medicine team or kind of a medical community. And it probably wasn't a big of issue for somebody like me that works in a fairly large institution where we have multiple physicians who we work with in the clinical setting and whose patients we rehab in the rehabilitation setting. But it was somewhat challenging for people that were in smaller environments, for people that maybe were new to the state and were looking for jobs. So it was a big step in promoting that autonomy and helping to assuage some of the concerns that the physicians had from a liability standpoint.
And it's a really unique development nationally too, that I'm kind of watching with interest to see if other states follow, because there are obviously positives for us, being able to function as autonomous providers and define our own protocol, and also be responsible for our own protocol. Is if there are things that we write in, we have to also demonstrate competence into our protocols. But this is driven just as much by the state medical society as us. And like Mike indicated, is physicians became concerned about what their level of liability would be, and they didn't know what that was. So to me, I think it'll be interesting to watch if this continues with other states, and if this becomes concerns of the physician providers in other states. I certainly have heard from athletic trainers around the country, often many in more traditional settings, that are concerned with a movement like this because they think it may diminish our ties with physicians potentially. And I don't see that at the practical level being the case. Is, we work closely with all of our doctors. They make referrals to us, they help define our care. And I think it's a big change versus how we function in essentially every practice act in the country right now. So so those are just some things I'm watching for and curious to see what happens in the future with other states.
Joe
Yeah,
brought
no,
up,
go ahead.
sorry, Joe brought up the State Medical Society. It was kind of an interesting conversation that happened with them in regards to this change, because when we proposed it, they initially weren't sure what to do with it, but through the relationships we have, especially with some of the UW team physicians, a couple of them wrote letters in support of this. And the person that was working with the State Medical Society basically said, well, if you guys think it's okay, I'm cool with it. So again, it goes back to kind of the relationships and having those good relationships. And when you can develop that and you can get those people on your side, it just kind of smooths the process and it helps facilitate things. The other thing that came up at times, and we looked at other practice acts, whenever we look at ours, we kind of look at what's in the overall statutes relating to healthcare professions. We're the only people that had that requirement.
Right.
So it was, kind of, if it's good enough for you, is it good enough for us type of thing at times when we had those discussions. But as Joe said, is kind of just a natural evolution of how we were kind of trying to move things forward and advance our language and the opportunities then that could be available for athletic trainers as a result of it. But like Joe said, it doesn't really negate any of the relationships that we've developed, and in some ways it might even enhance it. So there certainly are, I can understand the risks and concerns people would have, but I think part of it is having confidence in who we are and what we do. And I think those relationships we establish with our physicians help them feel comfortable from their end as well.
Yeah, I always had that question of, if I worked at the university, we had our team physician, they signed off, everything felt good there. But what if I wanted to go cover this random PRN event that that wasn't directly tied to my daily work, and like, what did that mean for the physician? Like, did I need to make sure they were okay with it, let alone your own personal liability for going off and doing something because you're now not under, the umbrella of a larger institution or a health system, especially if you're not getting paid through that entity. So that was always one of my questions too, is like, how did that all play out? And if I were a physician, I'd been like, well, wait a second. This isn't benefiting me at all, for the risk that I might be taking. So I think that's a really good point.
Right. And when we asked them to sign off on those things, they were signing off with the understanding, okay, this is what your kind of scope is that you're going to be working on. And these are the locations, these are the groups, these are those types of things. And if you want to go out as an independent provider, which fine, it's your right to do so. But is that what we asked our physicians to sign off on? So again, it goes back to clear communication and a full understanding of that prior to those types of things happening. But now this kind of makes that point moot, right? So now you can still do those things. You might have to get your own liability insurance to do it, or other protections from a risk management standpoint. But it kind of opened up those opportunities where if you do want to go in and contract as an independent provider, now you can do that without having the concerns of tracking down your physician and communicating that prior to them, or finding, you can only have one consulting physician. So it was important that you found one that would allow you to kind of do the things you needed to do to work in your chosen environments. That's a great point.
One more question around this, and more from your guys' experience or what you've heard, especially being tied into UW Health and all the outreach ATs there. It came up a little bit within the NCAA realm as I was leaving that area. Is how could this impact return to play decisions, concussion clearance, any of those things? Because some of that was underneath, potentially underneath the physician, but does that now kind of shift to what are the policies for an example of the NCAA? Do they require, physician final clearance, or, the state association, the WIA in our instance, of what those protocols are to help doing that? Or could it potentially, based on what the state looks like, put more of that onto the athletic trainer to make those bigger decisions around specific injuries?
You want me to take that one, Joe? Well, if it's done right, it shouldn't change anything, right? We basically still have our protocols that we follow. When dealing with specifically with concussions, our Concussion Practice Act doesn't really specify who has to make that decision.
Okay.
It has to be a healthcare provider that's been trained in the recognition and management of concussions and
Sure.
head injuries. So, some of those decisions are based on what certain state laws would require, right? And so a high school or the NCAA can't supersede what the local laws are in that particular state. So the policies and the things that are developed kind of have to at least tie into and be consistent with what the statutes say. But as far as decision making, return to play, I think that's best decided and best executed when it's a conversation that happens between all the people involved, right? It has to involve the athlete, it has to involve the physician, it has to involve the coaching staff and the strength and conditioning staff, or however that progression and that transition is occurring. So, does it mean that an athletic trainer can or should make those decisions? Well, it's kind of what we do, right? I have all the time, I have conversations with my physicians who say, okay, I don't need to see you, work with your athletic trainer, and then you can get back when they feel you are ready, right? So then that falls back on us to make sure that we have the skill set and, we have the return to play protocols in place to understand how to best do that. And if we can't, or if we aren't sure, that's when you just have to, know your own limitations for whatever injury you might be dealing with or whatever situation. And then working within your group and with those that can help you make that decision. So the decision that is made is the best one to get that athlete back as swiftly as possible, but as safely as possible. Did that answer your question?
Yep. No, absolutely. I think it was, one of those, sometimes you get maybe not the healthcare provider that you want clearing somebody for something when you wanted them to go to a physician. It was somebody else, and could, depending on where you're at, or, somebody's desire to get back, try and have almost potentially people making calls that based on the other policies and laws and things were not how it should be done, if this opened up anything in that regard.
Yeah. And we also have ATs and MDs who are on the WIA Medical Advisory Board who help make these decisions, at least at the high school level and middle school level anyway. But, in the end, Joel, our protocol, this was really negotiated in so we could get our initial regulation in every state. Is some of the people who may not have wanted us to have regulation said, this is something that provides extra safety to the public to have a physician sign off on our protocol. And there were certain things that just weren't realities about having a protocol in place. And so, I do think it's something that deserves continual scrutiny as to whether or not we should have one in every state. I do think it will probably come up in other states, but other healthcare professions don't have something like this. And I think we are a mature enough allied health profession at this point in time to be able to make those decisions and know when we need to refer or need to pass a decision on to someone else. And, and I think we deserve that respect as a profession as well.
Agreed.
Joel, I think you kind of said it earlier when you said, do I know what I know? Do I know what I don't know? Right. In essence, that's kind of what all healthcare providers do is knowing when you might need help or you might need assistance, and that's okay. We can't be experts at everything on everybody all the time. So understanding that, and as our profession matures, these are some of the responsibilities that come along with working in this field. But as Joe said, working through the WIA and, Tim McGuine has been working with the National Federation for years to kind of develop these things. And so as those policy and things emerge, again, they hopefully will kind of mirror what our efforts here from a legislative standpoint. But, that's just part of any healthcare profession is knowing when to refer or defer judgment to somebody else.
I completely agree with you there. Jumping to the next one that we're kind of currently in the middle of, Mike, you referenced the meeting that came up and had to get thrown together quickly. Unfortunately, and because of that quickness, I wasn't able to get out of clinic to get down there and be a part of it. But that's the talking about the parity language, and I believe that's getting that into our practice act. Yes, okay, I'm getting nods, so I said that correctly. Could we just start off with what is parity language and why does it matter, and why are we looking to reopen our practice act to have that be a part of it?
Well, the parity language is actually not part of our Practice Act. This
Okay.
is an amendment to an existing statute that looks at insurance reimbursement. So
Yep.
it's in a different section of our administrative code. And essentially, several years ago, a group of other health professionals were looking at kind of their reimbursement abilities based on what they were doing clinically. So the three groups that kind of spearheaded that a while ago were the optometrists, chiropractors, and dentists. Right. So whether it was they were looking to expand or whether they were dealing with certain procedures and the cost for that being denied by insurance companies, they basically said, well, if an insurance company is going to reimburse for this service, if that service is provided by a licensed healthcare provider, they can't refuse it because it's a service they already reimburse. And so the argument was that they were kind of picking and choosing which healthcare professionals could provide that service and
Sure.
not leaving it up to the patient or the physician or the decisions that they wanted to make medically, whether it's by convenience, whether it's by patient preference, or whether it's just, appropriate for that healthcare professional to provide it. So when we started looking and working with our reimbursement committee, and we were dealing with insurers that were not very willing initially to jump on board to reimburse us for the clinical services that we were providing. So we started looking at how we could go about this. And the first and probably the most important way, as Joe said, was to develop relationships, to educate, to have days and days and days of dialogue and communication, and to kind of sell ourselves and allow what our skill set is, what our training and Joe's remarkable personality when he would meet these people face to face, to convince them that, not only is this a good thing for us, because it could potentially be economically viable and financially a good idea, but it also is going to be something that's good for our patients. But after a while, some of those negotiations started to fizzle. So then I kind of took it on myself to kind of look again at what other healthcare professionals were doing, and I stumbled across this piece of administrative code. And one of the nice things about that is it's a piece of statute that's kind of a piece of language that's outside our statute. So technically, we're not opening up our Practice Act with that. And it's always easier to amend existing code than it is to create new code. And so that's kind of how this kind of emerged. And Joe, you could probably share a little bit more about some of those early negotiations that went on. So essentially what that piece of language states is that, again, if an insurer reimburses for services that are provided by other healthcare providers, they can't discriminate against a healthcare provider who is licensed and trained to provide that same service. So it's not like we're doing anything different. The insurance companies aren't really doing anything different because they're already reimbursing for those services. It's just now making sure that we're kind of on a level playing field. And so the goal there is to, provide patient choice, to kind of remove barriers to access for those services, and to, obviously create opportunities for athletic trainers to be a viable clinical entity. So not having to have those battles and making sure that if they are working in clinic, they're going to be reimbursed for the services that they provide, and removing some of the obstacles to achieving that.
That was perfect. Thank you for that. Like I now all of a sudden feel like I actually understand why we're going for it that I didn't before. So thank you for that. That was definitely what I was hoping for there. Joe, what do you have to add?
Yeah, I would just say, to provide a little bit of background on where we've been as a state with this is, we've had we've had employers, pursue reimbursement and advocate for their ATs for over 20 years now, since the year after we became licensed. And I think it was in 2010, the WATA went through a strategic planning process, and we basically agreed at that time to say that our goal was to be reimbursed consistently with other providers when we're delivering medically necessary types of care for athletes, for our patients. And so we agreed that we would pursue that by educating insurers at first, and often employers as well, to try and get to that point in time. And so we have been able to secure some 55 insurers in the state of Wisconsin who will say yes to us when we do request reimbursement for the right types of services. A lot of those are work comp payers, some are commercial carriers, some are HMOs. And sometimes we get approved just on prior auth with some companies that don't formally recognize ATs. But in the end, we also agreed that in that pathway is if we had to pursue a legislative solution or a legislative fix to this because we couldn't get to where we wanted to, that we would need to do that. And that's really where we are now. And for me, something that I hope I can be a part of, not only in Wisconsin, but nationally, is that the business decision of an insurance company not to reimburse an athletic trainer for services that they can deliver under their scope, we do it all of the time, affects our ability to work up to our scope of practice in hospital and clinic and independent practice environments. Is many times athletic trainers just can't get hired in those settings for delivering care they deliver in other settings. So it's obviously something that I've been passionate about trying to change, that I want to change for athletic trainers so they don't have to deal with this in the future, is that they can be employed in those types of settings if an employer wants to hire them. But I think that is the goal of this legislation is we hope we could get there from an educational perspective and advocacy perspective, but I don't think we can, and especially with our state's largest payer, United Healthcare. But there are others as well. So that's why we're involved in this process right now.
Just seeing our last kind of e-blast on how things went. What impact would this have for ATs? I think the main one, if I'm summing up right, is basically getting compensated for the same work that we're providing because they're doing it to others. What resistance might we be getting, and who from, and why do you think that is, when from what you both just laid out, it seems to be fairly intuitive that it should go forward and it makes just sense.
Right. Well, obviously the main opponents to this is the state's insurance industry, and Joe can kind of refer to that and their organization, their lobby groups, kind of what their main arguments have been all along. One of the things that comes up that we often have to kind of work around is the term mandate. Insurance companies and businesses don't like being told what to do by the government or by anybody else, right? Just like we want to make our own decisions independently with our patients, they want to make their own decisions as to what's best for their business model, and their bottom line and their shareholders. And I'm sure they have concern for their patients in there, and their insured members somewhere. But that has been part of the issue, is like, well, this is considered an insurance mandate. There has to be, for these types of pieces of legislation, the state budget office has to kind of look at what the potential costs are. And so they'll come up with a number. Again, Joe can probably relate more as to the mechanics of how that occurs, but they'll come up with a number, and then we have to kind of look at those costs over time and then kind of justify those as well. From other healthcare providers, we haven't gotten a whole lot of resistance on this. I'm sure we'll talk about the term vigorous as we wrap up.
That is the next one.
But, the physical therapists, the first time we proposed this to them, they said, wow, good luck. We don't think you'll get it, but okay, go for it. So at least, everybody else seems to have remained neutral. We haven't really had any opposition from physician groups. And, I've approached a couple of our doctors. If it gets to that point, they said, yeah, we could probably put our name to a letter or those types of things. So as Joe will allude to, most of the arguments have obviously come from the insurance industry itself.
Got it.
Yeah, and I think when we did the reimbursement pilot, that was from 2014 to 2017, we really identified really essentially because weren't a lot of sites across the country that were billing autonomously with ATs. So cost outcomes, or how effective is an athletic trainer delivering the same type of care after an anterior cruciate ligament reconstruction or a rotator cuff repairs, is how do they compare to other types of providers? Well, that was a gap in some of our objective data. So I think we're in a better position to be able to secure some of that data. I think that's what insurers want to see, is ultimately are we as cost effective as other types of providers when we deliver the same care to the same age group, for the same pathologies, things like that. I think importantly also, and we do have some pretty good data from the state of Massachusetts, who has proposed similar legislation, is the state tries to estimate, and this is really hard to get your arms wrapped around this. Our Medicaid office in our state has asked for the same thing, is like, what is the additional cost to insurers? What is the additional cost to Medicaid for this? And so the state of Massachusetts is an independent consulting firm. They were required to be able to do an analysis on this, and they're a similar size to Wisconsin as far as the number of licensed athletic trainers, is they took out estimates for 5 years as what it would cost the entire insurance industry in the state of Massachusetts if this type of language was improved there. And the costs were really relatively low, like in the first year, estimating some $800,000 to all insurers in the state of Massachusetts, because not many would start in the first year. There wouldn't be a lot doing it. But by the end of year 5, they estimated those costs to grow to approximately $6 million a year to all insurers. So again, it's hard to predict, but these aren't extraordinary costs to insurers when you look at what other types of services they have to consider paying for. But I think those things are on us. Like Mike said, is the PTs have kind of sat on the sidelines with this issue, but we have to be able to show objectively that we're cost-effective providers beyond being safe and effective providers.
And I think that's true of any business, right? If you have a business and you want to try a new initiative or do something, you kind of look at risk versus reward, cause and effect, those types of relationships. And some of this, I think, too, is just a matter of perspective, right? So the insurance company is going to look at it from, are we processing more claims? And of course they are, because there are going to be more people billing for those services. But when you look at it from the perspective of the patient's viewpoint, they're still getting those services regardless. If we can do it more efficiently, if we can get to them sooner, maybe they don't need 24 rehabilitation visits. Maybe we can do it in 8, right? So as Joe said, it's a hard thing to forecast and to estimate, but it's also part of a matter of perspective. And so, insurance companies have been battling government regulation for ages, and they've have lobbyists and governmental affairs people too that are highly skilled. So sometimes we don't know what the argument is going to be going in. We kind of know what their approach is going to be from a yay or nay standpoint, but it's one of the things you kind of learn as we go. And it's where Joe's group with OrthoVise, as far as being an advocate for our profession, has been really, really helpful, because they spearheaded kind of all these conversations. And I think not only Joe and his group, but we've all learned a lot, and we're able to kind of understand their perspective a little bit more effectively because of it.
I appreciate the insight on that. Last topic that we'll get to for this one, and we'll probably have to revisit third-party reimbursement at another time. And Joe, I'll reach out to you on that. You had mentioned the word vigorous as part of the negotiations years ago to get into the Practice Act and have that be a part of it. That is also something that is on kind of the WATA's list to get addressed. Why is it so important to remove? Why is that a goal? And then just tying it right into it, I'll let you guys get right into it, is, what barriers are we facing because of that? And I think some of those may be relatively obvious, but if you don't mind kind of shedding some light on it.
Well, the term in and of itself, it's one of the first lines in our Practice Act, and it basically is a descriptor that defines who we can actually treat, or who we define as an athlete, or what types of things and people who sustain athletic injuries we are allowed to treat. And part of the problem with that term is it kind of overshoots, if you will, a lot of the patients that I treat. And if you look at the definition of the term vigorous in the dictionary, that has kind of one connotation to it. But that term has also been used to describe levels of physical activity by a variety of healthcare related or oriented groups. So the CDC, the American College of Sports Medicine, a representative who testified for us referred to a definition that the Harvard Medical School defined, but they're all consistent, and they're based on levels of energy expenditure. So whether that's metabolic equivalents or whether it's kilocalories expended, the term vigorous is kind of exactly what it says. It's people that are engaged in very vigorous activities. But there are a lot of activities that are not considered vigorous, but are still sports. So if you look at those definitions, things that would be considered less than vigorous are things like softball, doubles tennis, golf, and then a variety of different employment activities like truck driving, working in a factory assembly line, certain farming or carpentry, landscaping, those types of things. So it essentially doesn't match up with the type of patient that we treat on a daily basis. So this is a matter of kind of making things consistent, right? Because I guess technically you can look at some of the patients we're dealing with, and our patient schedules would be scaled way back based on just that strict definition. Now, are there ways around it on a daily basis? Yeah, you could probably just ask the person, do you ever want to get back to X, Y, or Z? And if they say yes, you document that, and then okay, we can kind of move forward. But we shouldn't have to do that. We shouldn't have to creatively work around a definition within our statutes. Our definitions should match with what we can do, what we're trained to do, and who we can do it on. So it's a bit of semantics and wordplay. Part of the argument against removing that, and this argument has been consistent ever since we first approached this way back when Joe was our president, and we were kind of working through our Practice Act, is that they feel that it opens up the doors for us to treat anybody. And they always give examples when they testify of an elderly person who might have dementia, several comorbidities that, the example she gave the other day was she fell and fractured her kneecap. And this goes back to kind of the conversation we had earlier, is understanding our scope of practice, understanding our training. And if we encounter a patient on our schedule, and I do this frequently every other day when I triage my schedule, if there's somebody on there that's not appropriate for me to treat, boom, we address that and we get them to where they should be going. So there has to be some trust that the healthcare providers will understand how to do that and how to appropriately handle those situations when you encounter a patient that isn't essentially, within our scope of practice or with our level of expertise. So it's a way to try to eliminate some of that confusion. It's a way to hopefully streamline the process of how we schedule our patients and how we choose who we can treat. And it's a way for us, again, to hopefully remove kind of that potential barrier where somebody could call us out against this particular patient. And we actually had a situation in one of our rehabilitation clinics where a gentleman was middle-aged, kind of my age, wasn't very active. And his wife, who was either a PT or a PTA, I can't remember what she was, but she basically said, well, he doesn't do anything vigorous. This guy he just kind of chills, right? So there was actually some concern whether this person who had a knee scope, I believe it was appropriate for this athletic trainer to treat. And of course it was, right? I'd feel comfortable treating somebody my age that had a knee replacement. So it's a matter of, again, not restricting who we can practice on, but as Joe has mentioned several times, making sure that we can practice within our scope and do the things that we're experts at and trained to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think obviously this was, our definition of who we can treat, which is also pretty unique to healthcare professions, maybe entirely unique in the state of Wisconsin. Is we negotiated that initially that we would treat athletes only, and our 2010 amendment changed that to be able to allow us to treat people who participate in vigorous physical activity or who desire to return to vigorous physical activities. So we think that was a step in the right direction. We agreed to it at that time. Other professions will say that it's a safety issue and a really large expansion of our scope. And quite frankly, we just disagree with that. We have to work under referral of 8 different types of providers in the state in outpatient rehabilitation settings. So there is a level there that protects the public. And we also haven't had any evidence of cases where ATs are working with patients beyond our scope in front of our affiliated credentialing board. It just hasn't existed. And so I think we'll continue to fight for this as well, because it represents the people that we are trained to take care of, whether they're athletes or whether they're, any person in the population.
Right.
Fantastic.
And yeah, and as Joe said, is it a safety issue? Well, we certainly don't think so. Right. And the other aspects of our Practice Act, the other definitions that are there, the things we can do in our practice and our protocol essentially aren't changing. So everything else that does regulate us is essentially staying the same. So this is again, it's semantics. It's a word that probably is overly restrictive, and we feel it's just not necessary. But it can potentially impact the types of individuals that we can treat. And I think Joe's point about the referral is really, really important. And it kind of goes back to kind of some of the arguments we made about the reimbursement parity. Is it should be up to the physician and the patient and their healthcare team to provide or to decide who's best able to provide the service to that individual. And again, it goes back to patient satisfaction, patient access, delivering high quality patient care to get the outcomes that we all want. And whether that patient's appropriate for me or not, I think that's a decision that needs to be made on an individual basis. And it shouldn't be something that's decided based on an arbitrary term in our Practice Act.
I appreciate that, and I like that insight. Well, in the interest of time, because I know everybody's got other things for the day, I wanted to thank you both for shedding some light on this, both, as I mentioned, for the state of Wisconsin athletic trainers, but also just to give a higher view of it for kind of the entirety of the profession, because it is important. It's what's going to keep driving us forward, providing us new opportunities. So thank you both. Like I mentioned, Joe, I'll follow up with you on some third-party reimbursement at some point so we can highlight that and the work going on there, because that's always a topic that is popular on the social media. So thank you both again, and look forward to hopefully seeing you both at some point here in Madison. I'd love to get down to some of this stuff here in the near future.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Athletic Training Chat. I hope you took a bunch away from it in terms of what goes into the governmental process. I know it was a huge learning process for me and really opened my eyes to all of the things that go into making these changes that are not small. So I give credit to everybody who is working on this, no matter what role you have. It is complex, it is tedious, it is time consuming, but it's definitely worth it, and looking forward to doing more in the future that we can to help the process and just advance the profession so we can help more people and really have a greater impact. So thank you again to everybody doing that, and to Joe and Mike for sharing what they have done in the history in the state of Wisconsin. If you are interested in the idea of journaling, check out the Athletic Training Daily Journal. You can do a 14-day free sample at clinicallypress.org/shop. No payment info required, just need to fill out some stuff to download it, or you can check it out directly on Amazon. Just search for Athletic Training Daily Journal. But we will catch you all next episode. Thank you again for listening.